welcome. It's wonderful to have you all here. Welcome to Drake University. This is the 29th Bucksbaum Lecture, and in this evening it's presented in collaboration with the Slay Fund for Social Justice. So on behalf of the Martin Bucksbaum Distinguished Lectureship Committee and Brent and Diane Slay and the Slay Fund for Social Justice, I want to tell you how pleased we are that you're all here with us this evening. I'd like to begin with some important acknowledgments. First, I'd like to thank Melva Bucksbaum, who unfortunately couldn't be with us this evening, but she has been instrumental not only in the establishment of the Bucksbaum Distinguished Lectureship, but several years ago, along with her daughter Mary, made a very generous gift to expand its impact on the future. Second, I'd like to express our profound gratitude to Brent and Diane Slay, whose passion for social justice and passion for Drake University have resulted in a wonderful collaboration to support our students and our faculty members' engagement in the critical issues related to social justice. And in addition, it's their generosity and their friendship with President and Mrs. Carter that have made this evening possible. So please join me in thanking them. I also want to thank the Bucksbaum Committee, whose guidance and energy over the years has made the Bucksbaum Distinguished Lectureship a major event in the Central Iowa Committee. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to identify each of them individually. Many of them are here, their names are in the program, but please join me in thanking them for their work over the years. I also want to express a huge thanks to Erica Hartchen, who's in my office, who's the coordinator of the series, for all of her hard work and her guidance, and also to my wife, Maddie, for her efforts in supporting tonight's event. Thank you both for everything. As many of you know, the Bucksbaum Distinguished Lecture has been Drake University's most powerful and enduring event in fulfilling one part of the university's social compact, a responsibility at the core of a university and a civil society to serve as the place where the community comes together to discuss, to consider, and to debate in an atmosphere of civility and mutual respect the vital issues of the day. And we're very, very grateful to the Bucksbaums and to the Slays for enabling us to carry out this responsibility this evening in such a profound and impactful manner. Now, before I introduce the next person on the stage, I want one item of housekeeping. Those of you who have attended before have heard me say this. If you have anything in your possession that rings, buzzes, chirps, croaks, or plays the first 4 bars of your favorite song, I'd ask you to please make sure right now that it's not going to do that until after you leave this evening. So thank you. And it's now my pleasure to introduce a good friend and colleague, Professor Renee Cramer. Dr. Cramer is an outstanding teacher and scholar and director of Drake University's Law, Politics, and Society program. And it was Professor Cramer's visit, along with Diane Kolbeck, our Associate Vice President for Alumni and Development. It's their visit with Brent and Diane Slay that began a wonderful, ongoing conversation and collaboration that led to the establishment of the Slay Fund for Social Justice at Drake and to the visit of President and Mrs. Carter to Drake University today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cramer.
Earlier this afternoon, around 150 Drake University faculty, staff, students, alumni, and friends gathered with President and Mrs. Carter and Brent and Diane Slay to hear about the very good work being done in the hopes of achieving social justice by Drake community members. It was an energizing and inspiring afternoon. The Carters' visit this evening as part of the Bucksbaum Lecture and the social justice grants that they learned about today have been made possible through the direct involvement and generous philanthropy of Drake graduates, Brent and Diane Slay. The Slays graduated from the School of Education in 1970. Brent ran track while he was here, and he won 4 Missouri Conference championships and was later awarded the Double D Award. Diane, Brent will tell me a bit ruefully, was the honors graduate of the 2. She went on to be a teacher, and a mother, and she currently volunteers in Grand Rapids in both a retirement community and a school in the urban center. Brent entered the workforce with Terryberry Company, a manufacturer of corporate awards. He retired from Terryberry in 2004 as managing partner. Together, the Slays raised 2 children, Heather and Shane, and they are enjoying being the grandparents of 3. Brent tells me that their life isn't very noteworthy. I would disagree. Their intensive involvement with the Carter Center, their lifelong relationship to Drake University, have both culminated not just in this wonderful and exciting event, but in direct grants to students, faculty, and staff to help us make real our own personal commitments to creating a more just world. I have absolutely benefited from and enjoyed my relationship with the Slays. In our several conversations, Brent often refers to the work of William Sloane Coffin. Coffin made this distinction between charity and social justice. Charity, he wrote, is a matter of personal attributes. Justice is a matter of public policy. Charity seeks to eliminate the effects of injustice. Social justice seeks to eliminate its causes. Charity in no way affects the status quo, while justice leads inevitably to confrontation. The Slays share my belief that it is a vital role of the university in a democracy to provide a space, not a space for confrontation, but for conversation. And Brent and Diane believe that those conversations can be peaceful and fruitful. They have made use of their generosity and vision to help recognize Drake as a place where public conversations about social justice happen. And for that, I am exceedingly grateful. To introduce President and Mrs. Carter, I welcome Brent Slay to join me on stage.
Thanks, Renee, for your kind words. Thanks also to President and Mrs. Maxwell for your hospitality. And I also want to echo the thanks to Erica Hartchen and Diane Caldbeck for making this day possible. Now, prior to my introductory remarks to the Carters, let me say that I gave Renee a book of Bill Coffin's, who was an old friend of ours, and I wish I hadn't, for only one reason. I've got the same quote she used. My wife, Diane, said when I was rehearsing this with her, "You say that pretty fast. Maybe you should repeat it." Now I don't have to. So let us begin. Let justice roll down like mighty waters, and righteousness like an everlasting stream. Those are not my words, but they're good words from a good book, spoken by the prophet Amos. An old friend of mine, William Sloane Coffin Jr. by name, was fond of saying charity seeks to alleviate the effects of injustice, while justice seeks to eliminate the causes of injustice. I would suggest to you this evening that no living couple on the face of the earth has done more to eliminate the causes of injustice than Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter. Protecting human rights and social justice is a part of their DNA, and it always has been. From their early days together in Southwest Georgia, where they worked tirelessly to eliminate racial segregation, to the White House, where President Carter championed human rights and social justice throughout the world, and Mrs. Carter chaired the Commission on Mental Health, which resulted in the passage of the Mental Health Systems Act of 1980. From Habitat for Humanity, where the Carters donate 1 week of their time every year to help build homes alongside future homeowners, to the eponymous Carter Center, which they founded together in Atlanta in 1982. The center is one of the preeminent non-governmental organizations in the world. Their motto is waging peace, fighting disease, building hope. They do all three incredibly well. The center has monitored 92 elections in 36 different countries. They fight to eradicate or eliminate tropical diseases like guinea worm, river blindness, lymphatic filariasis, and trachoma. Mrs. Carter has established a mental health task force as well as fellowships for mental health journalism at the center. The Carters are, as we would say in Iowa, down-home people. They're humble people. They still live in the only home they've ever owned in Plains, Georgia. They still share in the duties of caring for their church, Maranatha Baptist, from mowing the grass to cleaning the restrooms. President Carter still teaches Sunday school when they're in Plains, and the Carters pose for pictures with everyone that shows up for Sunday school if, and that's a big if they stay for church services after Sunday school. Often, when I think of the lives of Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter, when I consider the courage, dedication, and humility with which they have lived their lives and served the cause of justice, the words of Rudyard Kipling's wonderful little poem, If, come to mind. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, the Carters are able to do that. President and Mrs. Carter are parents of 4, grandparents to 12, and great-grandparents to 7, we think, because as President Carter said on the way up today, there are 2 that are close. It's my distinct privilege and my great honor to introduce my friends, the 39th President of the United States and his First Lady, Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you very much for coming tonight, and Brent, thank you for those beautiful words, and I'm sorry that Renee took part of your speech, but I have to say that Brent took part of my speech, so we're equal. When I look at this audience, I can hardly see tonight, it reminds me of my favorite cartoon that was in the New York Times, New Yorker magazine last year. This little boy looks up at his father, and he says, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be a former president." Well, I made former president, but I wouldn't have done it if the people of Iowa hadn't put me on the road to the White House. So thank you again. I noticed that both Brent and Renee talked about social justice and tried to define what it is. Social justice and service learning is what we heard this afternoon in the beautiful presentation of the students who've been deeply involved in the opportunities that Brent and Diane Slay have given them with Renee's leadership. It was truly an emotional experience for me and Rosa to hear the students make their report on specific projects that they had undertaken in other countries and throughout Iowa and in just the immediate neighborhood around this great university. But I think that one of the things that I'd like to say is that social justice is really the broadest possible definition of human rights. I've been a professor now at Emory University for, this is my 31st year. ever since I was involuntarily retired from the White House by the 1980 election. And so I deal with students a lot. And I would say that if I asked almost any group of Americans, what are their basic human rights? You would immediately say freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, trial by jury. Those would be it. But in the areas that we serve, particularly in Africa and in the poorest countries on earth, they would say, I think the most basic human right is to live in peace and to have a place in which to live and to have enough food for my children and to have enough clothing to keep them warm in the winter. And the people who would make a response like that quite often are living on an income of 50 cents to $1 a day. And I think it's good for all of us to pause a few moments and just think about how we would live if we only had $1 a day. If you paid for housing and you paid for food you had to have, if you paid for clothing, there wouldn't be anything left for education or health care or self-respect or human dignity or hope that the future would be better. So I think that's what social justice is doing here in this wonderful university as the students take advantage of the opportunity. And it's basically what Rosalynn and I have done for the last 30 years. When I did leave the White House, we established the Carter Center, and I've been asked, and Rosalynn has tonight, to give you a brief description of what we've done during the last 30 years. This is an illustration of what we can inherit, having been the leader of the greatest nation on earth, and how that experience and that influence has helped us to reach out to others in a very exciting and challenging and unpredictable and gratifying way. It hasn't been a sacrifice. I don't want anyone to misunderstand us about that. But as Brent has pointed out, we try to bring peace to troubled countries, and we negotiate between people in one country that are on the verge of a civil war or already involved in conflict. And we try to resolve conflicts between two countries that are next door to each other. And sometimes we try to reach out to people that are not friendly with the United States. Rose and I go to North Korea. We go to Cuba. We go to Nepal. We meet with the Palestinians who are members of Fatah and also the members of Hamas. So we try to reach out to them and see what is the best in their hearts and minds and extract it and try to bring peace and understanding between them. One of the things that we've used as a weapon has been the holding of elections or the monitoring of elections. And as Brent pointed out, we've done 92 of them. Just in the last year or so, the elections about which you've heard in the so-called Arab Spring, we have monitored every one of those elections. The Carter Center has. In Tunisia and in Libya. In the news today about the terrible assassination or killing of a wonderful ambassador. And in Egypt, where they've now got a new government. First time they've had a democratic election, I guess you'd say, in 5,000 years. So that's what we do. And we also try to deal with afflictions of people that are suffering from illnesses that we no longer know in the developed world. Brent named a few of them. Dracunculiasis, onchocerciasis, lymphatic filariasis, schistosomiasis, trachoma. And these illnesses now afflict hundreds of millions of people. And we go into the villages and in the desert areas and in the jungles, and we actually just undertake projects that no one else wants to do. That's the basic premise of the Carter Center. if the World Bank or the United Nations or the U.S. government or Harvard University or Drake University is taking care of a problem that's important to us or other people, we don't get involved in it. We don't duplicate what other people do or compete with anybody else. We just fill vacuums in the world. And that has put us into these diseases, which the World Health Organization calls neglected tropical diseases. And so that's what we attempt to do. One of the diseases that we attack is dracunculiasis, or guinea worm. We started out with this disease in 20 nations in the world, 3 countries in Asia and the rest of them in Africa. We went to 26,500 villages. We've been to every one of them, either we or the people that we've trained.
Not Jimmy and me.
Not Rosalynn and me, but people that we've trained or sent. And we found 3.5 million cases of guinea worm. And this year we're down to, we won't have any more than 600 cases this year. And almost every one of those are in southern Sudan. So this is going to be the second disease in the history of humankind that's been eradicated from the face of the earth. Last year, we treated 12.5 million people so they won't go blind with river blindness with a medicine that Merck & Company gives us free of charge. And we deal with trachoma, which is the #1 cause of blindness, second only to cataracts. Trachoma is caused by filthy eyes. And if you go to a village that has Dinka children or Maasai children in Africa, you see from a distance, you think they're wearing eyeglasses. When you get close to them, you see that they circled around their eyes are a ring of flies getting moisture out of their eyeballs. And over a period of years, that causes infection in the eye called trachoma, and the upper eyelids turn inward, so every time that a person blinks their eye, it slashes the cornea, and that causes blindness. And one of the major things we do there is to get rid of the flies. So we began in Ethiopia to build latrines, outdoor toilets. And we thought maybe we'd have 5,000 toilets the first year. We now have built 1.2 million latrines. And we have I've become famous not for the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, but as the #1 toilet builder on earth. So those are the kind of things that we do, and we'll get to other things when you ask questions about anything you want to at the end. But I would say that the #1 thing that the Carter Center has done is what Rosalyn's going to talk about, that is mental health. And let me say quickly that if in the last 30 years the Carter Center hadn't done anything except support Rosalynn Carter in her mental health program, everything would have been worthwhile. So now I want to introduce to you the co-founder of the Carter Center, my wife of 66 years, Rosalynn
I'd already
Carter.
corrected him one time. Thank you. Well, I am so glad to be back in Iowa. I love Iowa. I came here in the campaign. We had no money. We didn't know anybody. I was in 105 communities in this state. 105. We had to ask somebody to have a coffee for us. And then we had to ask them if we could spend the night. But it was so much fun, and I had been keeping our books in our farm supply business. I could go to a farmhouse, and they might have 6 people. This was in the beginning, got a little bigger. I could tell them the price of corn. We had a corn shelling plant. I could tell them what kind of fertilizer. I knew what kind of fertilizer they used. It was so much fun. I just loved it. And then crowds got bigger and bigger, and you know what happened. We love Iowa. Well, I have worked in, but I might say first that we consider human rights to be the kind of umbrella over everything we do. We work consistently to try to make life better for people in the world. And one of the things that I have, which everybody's talked about, is my mental health program. I have worked on mental health issues for 41 years. I had a governor's commission, a president's commission, and now I have a really good program at the Carter Center. And this week, we have just had our 16th class of mental health journalism fellows. One day we were sitting around deciding, what else can we do about stigma? We were continuously to try to overcome stigma and to influence policy. That's what we spend our time trying to do. And we were sitting around, what else can we do? And somebody said, well, since the media have such an influence on how people feel about mental illnesses and people living with mental illness, that maybe we could bring some here and let them know, educate them, let them learn about mental illnesses. And what we know today is that the overwhelming majority of people with mental illness can live full, productive lives in their community. With research, we've learned so much about the brain, and there should be no stigma, no shame with somebody that's having a mental illness. So we bring the journalists in. We've even gone international with our program. The journalists apply with a subject. They don't lose their job. They come to us in September every year and tell us what they're going to write about. They've already told us the subject. They tell us what they plan to do. They come back the next year and tell us what they've done. So we have 2 classes, and we've gone international. We started with New Zealand, and we had them for 5 years. We financed their program. We give the fellows a stipend. We finance their program for 5 years, and then they are on their own. And New Zealand now has a really good program of fellowships for journalists. Then we went to South Africa, and South Africa now is on their own, and they have sustained their program. Then we went to Romania. Romania has 1 more year with us, and we're working with them now to help them find people to sustain the program in Romania. And it was really wonderful listening to the 2 from Romania, because there had never been a good article in the paper about someone living with mental illness, and they say now it's just a topic that everybody talks about, which makes me feel so good. So, and with good things about them. And we just chose our next country because I think next year might be the last one for Romania. So we have had 2 from Colombia in South America this time, and we're going to start a program in South America. And we've also gone international with a mental health program. This is the first time we've done that, is to go into a country and begin a mental health program. And you'll see my bracelet right here. Our country is Liberia. The Carter Center has lots of programs in Liberia, and the people have been at war there for 15 years. And we wanted to see if we could go and work with our health people and establish a program. We found out that there was 1 psychiatrist in the country. And so we have graduated now 3 classes, we've been there 3 years, of psychiatric nurses and physician's assistants. We now have 63, and we have one in 14 out of the 15 counties in Liberia. They come from the county. They have to be nurses. They come from the county. They go through our training, and then they go back to the county to work. And with our next class, we'll have one from that last county. So we're going to do 150 in all. And so I'm excited about that program. This one says, help people. It says, help people with mental illness, because the stigma there is like it was when I first started here 41 years ago. It's really bad. But there was a woman from Columbia University that I had worked with in my mental health work, and she's absolutely great. She's from Liberia. She resigned from Columbia University to go to Liberia to run the program. She's a friend of the president of Liberia, and we are so excited about how it's working. Well, I do work with my mental health programs, and Jimmy says when we do these conversations that he talks about everything the Carter Center does, and I just talk about mental health. But I'm involved in all of the programs. I went to Tunisia. I was one of the leaders of our election committee in monitors in Tunisia, and I just fell in love with that country. When the head of state fled, they picked well-respected people in the community to fill all the top governmental offices. And they were sure, when I got there, they were sure they were going to have a great election. They were working so hard to do it. I'm moving along. We went to see the Prime Minister, and I talked to him, and I gave him one of Jimmy's White House diary books when we started to leave, and tears came in his eyes. He got all choked up, and he couldn't thank me enough. He said, "Mrs. Carter, you don't know how much I appreciate this. I tried to read everything Jimmy Carter writes." Well, that made me cry. And then I found out, that he was head of the human rights program in Tunisia, trying to work for freedom. So that was exciting. In Egypt, when we did the election in Egypt, they had elected a parliament which had about only 7 women in the whole parliament, but there had been a ban in Egypt on genital mutilation and child marriage for years. And these women were in parliament making a lot of noise trying to lift the ban so the families could decide what their little girls would do. And so you can imagine that all of our friends in Egypt were really upset. And so we began talking about, we have a human rights defenders conference every year. We bring in people from all over the globe that are working in their countries under great danger to themselves sometime to bring about human rights in their country. And they come to the Carter Center. So while we were there, we decided, Jim and I decided that it would be great if we could take our human rights conference, defenders conference, to Cairo next year. And so we talked to Morsi, who's the head of the Muslim Brotherhood that won the election for president. And he said that he would be glad to send a representative. So that made us feel good. We're going in February to Cairo. I'm excited about that. And we have this woman that came from Senegal to our Human Rights Defenders Conference. And she called herself a cutter for genital mutilation. And there's an American that went over from college, and she's probably in her 40s now. And she had talked this woman into knowing that that was wrong, and they had talked to Imam. She came to our Defenders Conference last year, and she's wonderful. She's a Senegalese woman about this big, and she's going to make a big hit, I know, in Egypt. So I'm looking forward to that. Well, Jim is kind of pushing me, and so I was supposed to talk to 10 minutes. I think I went over my time, but anyway, we're so glad to be here, and now we're going to answer your questions.
You know, one of the interesting things about Egypt is that we met also with the chief mufti of Al-Azhar University. He's the #1 academic in the Sunni Muslim world. And his university is the oldest on earth. And it has 120,000 students. So he is the leader of the Muslim majority, the Sunnis. And he is preparing a special presentation to soon be issued on women's rights. And he's going to cooperate with the Carter Center next year. So we're trying to get the major religious organizations to insist in their own faith that women are equal in the eyes of God. And that's a very major project of the Carter Center.
Our Human Rights Defenders Conference last year was on women's rights, and it was going to be, we had already planned to have it on women's rights again this next year. So, okay, we're ready to answer your questions?
With some trepidation, yes. Yeah, we can't see anything, so we're going to have to just listen.
Are we on? Great. Let me tell you how this is going to work, and this is going to be an experiment for us, and I think I think it's going to work well. But there are 2 microphones out there, and we want to make sure that we don't have long lines, and so we have student monitors who will be roaming around the audience. If you would like to ask the Carters a question, please attract their attention by raising your hand, and you will be serially directed to come down to one microphone or the other. And please don't come down to the microphone until you're asked to. I would ask 2 things of you. If you do feel inspired to approach the microphone and ask a question, I'd ask 2 things. 1, please make sure that you have a focused, brief question to which the Carters can respond. Not an ideological or philosophical monologue, as tempting as that may be in front of such a robust audience. This is not a hypothetical request, which is why I'm making it. Secondly, again, please be brief. Remember that everyone came here to hear President and Mrs. Carter, and not you. There have been times in the past when I've made this request and it hasn't been honored. If it looks like it's about to not be honored, I'll remind you of it, and if that doesn't work, the sound technician and I have an agreement. So with that, let me turn it over to those of you who would like to ask President and Mrs. Carter questions, and I look forward to the discussion.
David, you might stay there in case we can understand.
I'll be right here soon.
Tell us what your question was.
Okay.
Are we ready?
We're ready.
President Carter, I'm a former ecumenical accompanier with the World Council of Churches and spent 3 months last fall in Area C in the West Bank in the South Hebron Hills. I have been monitoring since then a deterioration in human rights with demolitions and dispossessions and harassment. Since you will be going to Jerusalem soon, I would like to ask you if you can raise the issue of human rights in Area C with those people you speak with, particularly in the South Hebron Hills. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate that question. As a matter of fact, at this point, about the only organization that I know of in the world that's still trying to work for peace for Israel and its neighbors is the Carter Center, because the United States government now, for the first time, is not making any attempt, and we haven't for the last 2 or 3 years, to bring the Israelis and the Palestinians together to negotiate a peace agreement based on a 2-state solution. That is, Israel within its own borders and the Palestinians within their borders on the West Bank. And so this is something that we are doing. The Carter Center has never abandoned this effort. We have a full-time office in Jerusalem and in Ramallah in the West Bank, and also, by the way, in Gaza. And we work very closely with other countries who are trying, like we are, to bring peace. That is Egypt and Jordan and so forth. So I'll be visiting next month in Jerusalem and Ramallah, in Gaza, in Jordan, and also in Egypt to try to bring the people together. But one of the worst human rights violations on earth now is what is being done to the Palestinians, because the whole commitment of the international community, including the United States government, is that there will be a 2-state solution with the Israelis living within their pre-67 borders, modified, as President Obama said at the beginning of his administration, by mutual negotiation with land swaps. So if they agree, then Israelis could live on part of the West Bank territory, and then if that was agreed by the Palestinians, the Israelis would give the Palestinians that much territory of their own. This is what the basis for peace will be. And that's the only way that I know that Israel will ever have peace in the future, as they got with Egypt when I happened to be president. One thing also that can be continued, obviously that's very important, is the peace agreement that was negotiated 33 years ago with Begin and Sadat when I wrote the peace treaty and they agreed. And that's never been violated even one word in the treaty. When Mohammed Morsi was elected president of Egypt, being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, I met with him before and after he was elected to make sure he would promise me and the world that he would abide by the treaty terms, and he will. So you can rest assured, the one who asked the question, that when we get there, we'll be talking about basic human rights, which involves peace for Israel and peace for the Palestinians, with justice and peace agreement in the future that will prevail on both. We always bring this up when we go to any part of that country, and we also bring it up, by the way, with our own leaders in this country and with European leaders. Peace, I think, for Israel is one of the most important commitments of my life. But Israel cannot have peace unless peace and justice comes to their neighbors.
President and Mrs. Carter, hi. Dr. Alan Kozlow, I want to thank you first. I just got back from South Sudan helping the United Nations High Commission to set up 5 refugee camps for 150,000 refugees, and I want to thank you for your work there. But my question is actually closer to home. I, as a member of the Jewish community here, am made to feel other by the political process which emphasizes religion and Christianity, and and so I want to see how you, and I think that in essence is a social justice issue within the United States, that basically fundamentalist Christianity is being forced down the throats of people who do not share that belief and who have their own belief structure, and I want to see how you feel about that. And thank you again for your work in South Sudan and Sudan.
Well, I think the essence of fundamentalism, no matter whether it's in religion or not, fundamentalist Christians, fundamentalist Jews, fundamentalist Muslims, and so forth, I think would all come under the basic umbrella of believing that they are special in the eyes of God, and that when they say something or believe something, it also represents the sole will of God. And that leads to the next step, that is, anybody who disagrees with me is also disagreeing with God. And therefore, I am superior to them, and in extreme cases, I treat you, since you are so wrong, as a non-human being whose life is not worthwhile. So I think that fundamentalism in any extreme case is very bad. But I think what we see around the world, we held the election, for instance, in Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim country on earth, and it now has a pure democracy. And the first time they had an election, which we were there, the leader of Indonesia turned out to be a woman. So there is a difference, obviously, in the Muslim world and in the Christian world and so forth. The 3 biggest democracies on earth are India, basically Hindu, the United States, basically Christian, and Indonesia, basically Muslim. So you see, Christians don't have a monopoly on democracy. Another thing that I think is good for us to remember is that all the major religions share the same basic principles of human rights, the ones I mentioned earlier. All the religions preach that their God believes in peace. They believe in equality. They believe in freedom. They believe in the alleviation of suffering. They believe in the rights of the poorest to be given special opportunity to improve their future. No matter what you believe, what religion you have, those premises are the same. So extremism, if you're a Christian, fundamentalist, or otherwise, I would certainly condemn that. I started out my life, and I lived until 12 years ago, I was a Southern Baptist. And then the Southern Baptists had an argument between fundamentalists, let's say conservatives on the one hand, and moderates on the other. And the Southern Baptists decided at their convention, I'm leveling with all of you, the Southern Baptists decided at their convention 2 things with which I didn't agree. One was that the Scripture was no longer based on the teachings of Jesus Christ, whom I worship.
In their creed.
And then they established a creed where everybody that wanted to be a leader within the Southern Baptist Convention had to agree to a creed. I don't believe in that. And they also ordained that a woman was inferior in the eyes of God, and that a woman could not be a pastor, a woman could not be a deacon, a woman could not teach even boys in school. And so because of that, Rosa and I announced that we would no longer be part of the Southern Baptist Convention. But we're still loyal Baptists, we're still Christians, and we believe that we should be friendly and at peace with our friends who are Jewish, our friends who are Muslims, as long as they believe in the same human rights that we adopt. I hope I haven't over-answered your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, President Carter. I thank you for trying to bring social justice and improve the human rights all over the world. What did you do to help the persecuted and oppressed Christians in the Middle East, especially Egypt and Iraq? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as you may or may not know, there was a substantial Christian community in Iraq before the Iraqi war broke out. As a matter of fact, one afternoon, my wife and I were at home in Plains, where we live, and the leaders of the Muslims, the Sunnis and the Shia Muslim faith, came to our home, along with the chief leader of the Christian community as well. And so in Iraq, for centuries, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Christians, and a few Jews had lived in harmony. I would say that the best example of that in any country I've ever been to was in Syria, before the recent outbreak of violence erupted. So everywhere I go, representing the Carter Center, if we get to be accepted in a community as friends because we're working on health problems or trying to bring peace and so forth, I always reach out to the Christian community. One of the most vivid examples of that was when I was in the White House, and Uganda had a dictator named Idi Amin. Maybe some of you would remember Idi Amin. He was one of the most oppressive dictators that ever lived in the world. And I condemned Idi Amin's persecution of his own people. He wanted to lash back at me. So he captured every one of the Christian missionaries serving in the rural areas of Uganda. And he announced to the world, and particularly to me personally, that he was going to kill one Christian every week until I apologized to Idi Amin for condemning his human rights policies. I didn't know what to do. So I called the king of Saudi Arabia and asked him to intercede. So the king of Saudi Arabia induced Idi Amin to release the Christians, missionaries, if they would leave Uganda. And eventually, Idi Amin agreed. There were 53 of them, and none of them left Uganda. They all decided to stay there and continue their witnesses for the people in Uganda. So wherever we possibly can, Rosa and I try in Egypt, which is now about 10% Coptic Christians, and in other countries where they are persecuted, to help not only Christians, I would say, but also people of other faith who are living in a minority. I'll add one other thing that's interesting. I'll be very quick. There were a group of Syrian Jewish men living in Brooklyn. And I had a very good friend who was the congressman from Brooklyn. And these Syrian Jewish men couldn't find any wives. And their religion... Yeah, Syrians. Yes. Anyway, I'll have to explain this to Rosalynn afterwards. But yes, Syrian.
I knew about it. I didn't remember them to be Syrian.
The congressman came to see me, and I knew President Assad in Syria. So I went and talked to him about it, and he said he would send 100 Syrian Jewish women to Brooklyn and see if they could find husbands. So he did that, and 30 of the men and married women from Syria, and the other 70 women went back home. And so I became a matchmaker for Syrian Jews. So no matter what the minority is, I try to help them.
Thank you.
And Assad had been very good to the Christians in Syria, and they have supported him.
Yeah, almost all the Christians in Syria still support President Assad, the son of the president that I just mentioned to you. So the Christians are afraid that if the revolutionaries in Syria prevail, almost all of them are Sunni Muslims, and the Christians are afraid that they will not be protected anymore as they have been for a long time under the Assad family. I'm not defending Bashar al-Assad because I think he's been too oppressive in using force against the revolutionaries, but the Christians and other minorities are supporting the government. That's one reason that the government has lasted this long.
President Carter, this question comes from our online community. We have a question from Kevin, who is a current Drake graduate student in the School of Education. So just background, Drake has been encouraging Facebook and Twitter users to ask questions. So we've got this from a Facebook user. And Kevin's question is, our U.S. education system has come under great scrutiny in the last 10 years with no child left behind legislation and educational reform. What do you feel are the keys to building a strong American educational system that prepares our students to compete globally in a way we never have had to do before?
Well, as you all know, in the past, I would say that America had one of the best education systems on earth. When I was president, I thought that the best higher education system was possibly in California. But no matter about that, I think the great universities in this country, including Drake, are still the best on earth. And this is proven by the number of foreign students who come here for their education from China and from other nations as well. I met some Malaysian students here who were studying at Drake while I was eating supper tonight. But as far as the elementary and secondary education in our country, it has really gone downhill in recent days. I think part of the reason is that I'm not blaming all the problems on educators, but one is that there's not an adequate amount of money still going to the schools to keep them abreast of modern developments. When I was a young man just home from the Navy, one of the first jobs I got was to be appointed to the Board of Education, and I soon became the chairman of the Board of Education during the segregation to integration years. It was during some very difficult times. And then and now in my own county, the Board of Education can levy its own tax millage independently of anybody else just to support the schools. And we had a sharing proposition. So I would say that there are 2 or 3 things that can be done. One is for the teacher unions not to protect the teachers, but to devote their attention to protecting the rights of its students. And I think it's very good. I think it's very good to have some kind of a test on the quality of teachers, maybe based in part of their income, on how well their students do. This has to be done with a great deal of care, because there are obviously areas of Georgia, for instance, that have a great population of African Americans. In fact, the little town where Rosa and I live are about 2/3 African Americans. And they haven't had a chance in life, like most of the white people, to benefit from long years of good education. So there has to be special attention given to that. But within the same school, I would say that you can judge whether the teachers are good. And so I believe that the competition that's now being proposed by the federal government is being helpful in letting the states compete with each other to see who can make the most improvements. Another thing that has concerned me lately, which I don't condemn, is the special schools that are set up for more privileged students. And every time we rob a low-income school of part of its income because the bright students and the rich students leave, we need to compensate those poor students' families and let them have better education. So it's a very complex issue that I don't think anybody has solved. Those are just some thoughts for Kevin to consider.
Good evening, President and Mrs. Carter. My name is Olivia O'Hay. I'm a first year here at Drake, and I would like to thank you so much for being here tonight, first of all. And second of all, CNN just reported on the Libyan crisis, and they called it Barack Obama's Jimmy Carter moment. I was wondering your views on this, given your foreign policy and domestic policy experience, and how we can create an environment conducive to democracy and humanitarian rights in such a conflict-ridden area.
I think I understand the question. It's the kind of question sometimes I don't want to understand, but well, you know, I think that we have seen when I was president the Iranian hostages taken, and this was a very serious disappointment to me to have innocent hostages taken captive and kept captive the last year I was in office, and I tried to get them extracted and was unsuccessful. And I had a choice to make then. I could have destroyed Iran with our own military capability. But in the process, I would have killed tens of thousands of innocent Iranians. And so my commitment was to do two things. One was to make sure every hostage came home free and safe, and the other one was not to kill any innocent people in the process. So I had advice, I wouldn't even exclude my own wife, who thought that I should go and take military action because it would show the macho demeanor that many people like in an American president. Go to war and you're kind of a hero. If you stay out of war and preserve peace, you're too weak. So we decided to negotiate with the Iranians, and it took a long time. The last 3 days I was in office as president, I never went to bed. I stayed up full-time negotiating with the Ayatollah Khomeini, and eventually every hostage came home safe and free, and never did we lose any innocent lives. So many people still look on that as a symbol that I was a weak president. Sometimes it takes more courage to preserve the peace than it goes to war.
And I don't like it when they say that, but I don't worry about it because I'm so confident that Jimmy was a good president. Jimmy worked with the Republicans and the Democrats. He passed more legislation than any president since Lyndon Johnson, including the ones up until today. And I just wish Obama good luck and to have as much courage as Jimmy Carter had.
Iowa is so honored to have you here today, President and Mrs. Carter. My name is Karen Person. I am the co-chair of the Sentencing and Corrections Committee for the League of Women Voters of Iowa. I am particularly concerned about Iowa's prison population. We have quadrupled over 20 years. However, many of those bed spaces go to the mentally ill. Over 40% have been diagnosed with serious mental illness. Any thoughts about what to do with the seriously mentally ill in our prison situation?
Well, let me start by saying that we have changed in a dramatic way in this country in the last 30 years. When I was governor, and when Robert Ray was governor, we tried throughout the nation to minimize our prison population. We had a competition between Georgia and the adjacent states in how much we could reduce the number of people in prison. That has changed dramatically since then. And America has now got into the position of wanting to see how many people we can put in prison and how many we can keep there. When I left office as president, we had 500,000 Americans in prison. We now have almost 2.5 million Americans in prison. We have the largest percentage of citizens incarcerated in jail than any country in the world. And so this is what we have done. And some states have passed 3 strikes and you're out and so forth. And if you go into the prisons, which I do, and if you work with prisoners, which I do, you come to realize that a large portion of these young people in prison are there because they have possessed, not sold, marijuana. And I'll go back and tell you something you may not like. In 1977, I made a speech about my drug policy. And I called for the decriminalization, not the legalization of marijuana, so that a person who owned less than 1 ounce of marijuana would not be put in prison, but would be given treatment and rehabilitation. And so we need to do something. We need to do something about this issue. And let me say one other thing. Most of the people in prison now, and those who are sentenced to death, are the same ones. They're the minorities and those people who are mentally ill. And you can't even dream of a rich white man or woman being executed. But we still have, in this country, a death penalty, which is also, in my opinion, a violation of basic human rights. And let me add one other thing. The largest mental institutions in this country, I'll let Rosa finish the sentence.
He was taking my remarks. The largest, it's a tragedy. The largest mental health center, mental health treatment center, is the Los Angeles County Jail. The second one is Rikers Island. It is tragic what we're doing to people who need help instead of being sent to prison. There are several things that are happening in the communities. And Georgia, we are in a really a positive situation. I don't know what we're going to do about Medicaid. Every state has to overcome Medicaid, but we're working with our state mental health, behavioral health program to try to get that done right, but I don't know what's going to happen about it. But our mental health program joined in with the advocates in Georgia. Actually, I went and spoke to sheriffs, I went to churches, spoke to churches, I spoke to anybody, policemen, people that might help join in with the advocates. And the advocates brought a suit, and my mental health program joined as a friend of the court against the state. They were already under one federal suit. But anyway, we deliberated. We got everybody to the Carter Center. We worked with the state and the federal government at the Carter Center. And the judge finally ruled in our favor. And I don't know, I think it was 2008, but it came, the settlement came down on Amy Carter's birthday, October the 19th, and it was so good. We have to now provide it was because of the treatment in our mental facilities in Georgia. We now have to have a place for every adult that comes out of a hospital to go, to get service in the community. And we actually got an increase in funding for mental health in our state because they had no choice. They're having to do that. We're monitoring it really closely. And in the meantime, when we were doing that, we had this one person who developed a vision of what would be a perfect mental health system if we could get it. And we have a chance now in Georgia to do something about that, and we have possibility of making a model for the country. But mental health community is moving toward community services now, and also to integration, so that people go to one place and get help for physical or mental illnesses. And I think that's going to help overcome stigma too. But integration and recovery. So our mental health system is moving in the right direction if we can ever get over the stigma, which hurts so much, and it keeps people from developing good programs. It keeps legislators from making the right decisions. And so I'm really, really concerned about the situation about the prisons, but I'm doing all I can, and so is the mental health community that I work with, which is the mental health communities in the whole country. We have people from all over the country, and federal and state officials that come to our meetings, and so we're trying to do the best we can. But the sad, sad part is you can get money for prisons, and you can't get money for mental health services. It's a tragedy.
Well, let me add that thanks to Rosalynn Carter and thanks to a federal judge, Georgia is probably going to be the only state in the nation that increased its budget for mental health.
President and Mrs. Carter, good evening. Thank you for being here. President Carter, I've always regarded you as a voice of reason in our country that's, in these times it's so lacking. My name's Greg Howenstein. I'm a political communications professional, and not a day goes by where we don't see a new ad, a new video, a new tactic that makes me want to quit and, join some cleaner profession like cleaning sewers. I'm wondering if you have any advice for how we go in the opposite direction, how we restore civility to our politics, because I think that's why so many good people don't run for office, which we need more real people to do. Thank you.
Well, as Brent pointed out, and as I've repeated, the Carter Center has monitored 92 elections in the world, all of them troubled elections. And we have studied the election systems in almost every nation that exists, in every continent. And I would say that one of the worst democratic election systems we have is in the United States of America. Because increasingly it violates a basic principle in a democracy, and that is that all are created equally and that all voters should have an equal right to choose who their leaders will be. But with the stupid ruling by the Supreme Court 2 years ago, we now see the elections flooded with money from very wealthy people and corporations, some of them owned by foreigners, that shape the outcome of our primary season and also the general election. This is a new development. When I ran for president against incumbent Gerald Ford, a very wonderful man, and I ran against later when I was defeated by Ronald Reagan. You know how much money they and I raised for our presidential campaign? Zero. We didn't raise a penny. And you know how many negative commercials we ran against each other? Zero. We never ran one. So all of that has happened in recent years. And this year in the federal elections for president and for the Senate and for Congress, Americans will spend $6 billion. That's $6,000 million on the election. And that money mostly goes to destroy the reputation of opponents. And so by the time the election is over, the people in a state that's flooded by commercials like you are in Iowa now, and like Virginia is, and like North Carolina is, and others, kind of lose confidence in both candidates. And when you get to Washington now, the candidates are so polarized, politically speaking, that they don't speak to each other. And if a president, no matter if it's a Democrat or a Republican, makes a proposal, the other party's first reaction is, we will not support this character because we don't like him and we don't want to see him get reelected. So that has permeated our position. Other countries don't do this. For instance, I made a speech last week to an international group in Washington from this hemisphere. There are only 2 countries in this hemisphere that don't have full public financing for campaigns: the United States and Venezuela. And Venezuela has the best voting system on earth. You touch a touch screen and you vote, and your vote is automatically transmitted into a central counting station. And at the same time, it prints out a paper ballot. So you can compare your vote on the paper ballot with the touch screen, and then you put the paper ballot in the box if it's correct, and you can count the ballots later on if you want to. But let's take Mexico, for instance, right next door. I know Vicente Fox was here not too long ago. When Vicente Fox was elected, and now they have a $23 million limit on what can be spent in a presidential campaign, and no candidate can have a negative commercial on television or on the radio. So what can be done about it? I think if we could just get 2 of the U.S. Supreme Court judges to see the light and to realize the serious mistake they've made, then we can go back to having elections in this country as they were when I ran for office, financed by the $2 per person checkoff that you put on your income tax return, and have elections that are financed by public funds. And that's what almost every other nation in the world does.
Thank you, sir.
I've just gotten the signal from the person who runs your world that we have time for one more question. Is that correct? So this will be the last one. Okay.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, President and Mrs. Carter, for coming to Drake University. My name's John Olson, and as experts in running open and honest elections, one, what is your opinion of the voter ID laws that are in 17 states throughout this country? And second of all, how would one who would be interested in helping you monitor elections throughout the world get involved with the Carter Center and your election observing process?
Well, I think the voter ID laws have been designed specifically to prevent people from voting rather than to have any correction of fraud. If you look at the court records for the last 15, 20 years, there haven't been more than 5 cases of people imitating somebody else and trying to vote that were convicted. But the voter ID laws have been passed in order to prevent people from voting who don't have a driver's license and who don't have a chance to go to the courthouse and get an ID card with a picture on it. So I think that has made a lot of difference. As far as monitoring elections is concerned, we generally send in about 6 long-term observers into a country months before the election is scheduled to monitor the qualification of candidates, the registration of voters, the preparation of the campaign, and to make sure that everything is honest and fair. And then we bring in about 80 or so observers on a short-term basis, and that's where you could come in to go to the country about 5 days in advance and then be scattered all over the country to observe what goes on election day. Rosa and I generally go to the capital city, and we get reports from all our observers to come in to correct any mistakes that are being made. So that answers your question. Let me close by saying this. I think all of us, I mentioned what great religions have in common. And I would say that most human beings in our own private lives would like to comply with those basic principles: peace, justice, alleviation of suffering, protecting the environment, things of that kind, ordained by Allah or by God, whomever we worship. And I think the same thing applies not only in a private individual's life, which I've just said, but I think it applies in the life of a nation. And I've thought often, what is the definition of a great nation? What are the characteristics of a superpower? I think a lot of us would say that the United States is by far the strongest country on earth, maybe economically and certainly militarily. Our military budget is greater than the next 20 or 25 countries, maybe equal to all the rest of the world. So we can defend ourselves and we can protect ourselves. But what is a definition of a great superpower? I would like to see the United States sometime in the future be so that no matter where a person lived on earth, if they had the prospects of a war or armed conflict, they would say, why don't we go to Washington? Because Washington is one place on earth that believes in peace. And if they had a concern about freedom and honest elections, they would say, why don't we go to Washington? Because Washington has the best democracy and the best election system on earth. And if they were concerned about global warming or the environment, they would say, why don't we go to the United States and let the United States be our leader? Because the United States is in the forefront of marshaling all the capabilities of science and technology to make sure that we protect our environment. And they would probably say, why don't we go to Washington if we have a question with immigration? Because the United States has figured out the best way on earth as a superpower to treat people who want to come here and work and abide by the law and ultimately become citizens. And they would probably say, why don't we look at the United States as well? Because the United States is the most generous country on earth. I think those are the characteristics of a superpower. And my hope and dream and my confidence in the future, particularly the young people I met with this afternoon, is that someday we'll be able to say, in all those ways, the United States has earned the right to be the world superpower. I have confidence in that. Thank you.
Wonderful to be with you, and good night.